friends, Namaskar. I am here this Saturday to talk to you on a few important aspects of the National Education Policy. This is a 5-part series where I will not only decode the National Education Policy for you, but suggest several implementation strategies as well. As always, I will share a few ideas and also provoke you to a few more. I urge you to share your thoughts with me so we both learn and progress together. I can be reached on the social media platforms as well, and my coordinates are there on the screen. The National Education Policy proclaims curriculum and pedagogy will be transformed by 2022, the year currently we are in order to minimize rote learning and instead encourage holistic development. Probably it will shift by a year or so. It also proclaims students as getting 21st century skills such as critical thinking, creativity, scientific temper, communication, collaboration, multilingualism, problem solving, ethics, social responsibility, and of course digital literacy. These attributes in a policy that kept the country waiting for more than 3 decades are welcome. Though one would wonder why they should be only 21st century skills. They would have been as important in the earlier centuries as well. The people then would also have been as creative. Semantics apart, a good attempt has been made to collate all the skills that are required. Minimizing rote learning calls for a fundamental shift in teaching, learning, and assessment pedagogies. These skills, the pedagogies and assessment methodologies, they gestate long before changing. Hence, we will be seeing the changes probably in the next 5 to 6 years to come. 4 long years of work in progress has culminated in some worthy suggestions and some real concerns in the National Education Policy. The increased stress on investments in education and skill development, especially after they saw a downward trend in the past few years, is both welcome and much needed in a country with more than 60% of the population young and in the age group of 25 to 35 years. The country needs an equitable education to serve all kinds of disparity, whether it's caste, class, religion, gender, or disability based, especially in the aftermath of a drop in the functioning of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan and Rashtriya Madhyamik Shiksha Abhiyan by 30 and 70% respectively, just a couple of years ago. One important parameter that defines equity is the curriculum. National Council for Educational Research and Training, NCERT, and State Council for Educational Research and Training, the earlier was in the center, later are in the states, would do well to address all the concerns past, present and future, irrespective of and in spite of various ideological shifts that may influence them. The other is the medium of instruction or the language. Hindi admittedly is a sensitive issue down south, but is a great binding force in most of the rest of the country. This, however, must be seen to not disrupt successful implementation of the policy. Whereas the GER, the gross enrollment ratio in primary education is about 98. Almost everybody goes to school with very little dropouts. It falls to 65 to 70 in the secondary education and to 26 in the higher education space. Now, one reason for the fall from 98 to almost 70, is the unavailability of secondary schools in the same way as the availability of the primary schools. In a country where a premium is attached to education by every family, rich or poor, the draft signals setting up new schools and establishment and merging of new institutions. This is an idea worth implementing. Replacing the UGC, University Grants Commission, by a Higher Education Commission of India, HECI, is a much needed reform that can promote greater autonomy and focus on better academic outcomes with facilitating and enabling provisions, besides removing the overlapping that exists between different regulators. However, it appears that HECI, Higher Education Council of India, may not have financial powers, given that the Higher Education Functioning Agency, HEFA, a joint venture of the Ministry of Education and Canara Bank, has already been set up for financing creation of capital assets in premier educational institutions like our IITs, IIMs, central institutions, and so on. Further, the scope of HEFA has been greatly expanded to cover school education and institutes under Ministry of Health, whereas HEFA seeks to develop the top-end institutions like the IITs, the IIMs, AIMS, and others into world-renowned institutions. It's debatable if funds alone would do this for us. A lack of synergy between HECI and HEFA must not become one of passing the buck game, for effective research and development is greatly intertwined with finances. The national education policy, correctly though a little ambitious, lays stress on 100% and 50% enrollment at the primary and higher education respectively. Massive funding is needed to realize these goals. The Economic Survey 2019-20 noted that the expenditure on education by the center and the state governments as a proportion of the gross domestic product (GDP) has been around 3% between 14-15 to 18-19. The National Policy of on Education, released way back in 1968, recommended the spending of education to be about 6% of the gross domestic product, GDP. The National Education Policy 2020 reaffirms the recommendation of increasing the public investment on education to 6% of GDP. One would have liked probably much more than this. One suspects the recommendations seem to rely more on hope than experience. Let's see some figures, some numbers. NDA-1 allotted 1,104 billion rupees out of a total budget of 17,949 billion rupees to Ministry of Education in its first year of 14-15, which was a promising 6.15%. However, in the subsequent years, 15-16, 16-17, 17-18, it went down from 5.44 to 4.68 to 3.71% respectively. Even as total budget in 17-18 went up to 21,467 billion rupees, which was a good 19% rise on its figures 3 years earlier. Whereas the budget went up, the spend went down on education. It's worth noting that the gross national income in the same period went up from 1,41,022 billion rupees to 1,28,350 billion rupees, which was again a 22% rise. However, it appears that the public spending offset the government drop in spending. Massive private sector investment must have made a difference. Expecting only the government to fund the education may not be practical over the private sector. So the private sector also must chip in. Therefore, we must also look at as an alternative or explore building robust PPP models, public-private partnership models in education. On the other hand, our experience tells that PPP models have been successful only in infra-based projects where the returns are assured. One more concern is the taxes levied on the education services. For example, levy of GST on value-added services in education is not conducive to bringing down cost of education. Today, various interventions are happening, like value-added courses being introduced seamlessly into the curriculum. Now, if one were to pay GST on that, probably there is something amiss. The recommendation to change the structure of the school with a start from 3 years of age, merging 9 to 12 standards into an 8-semester framework, replacing the current assessment with application-based assessment pattern, creating new school complexes and special educational zones for backward areas is a radical and brave idea. One must appreciate the provisions. Removal of junior colleges idea is actually a throwback on a 3-decade-old system. Including preschool with government school system will provide infra and logistic challenges, and free control suggestion in private schools can pose probably legal challenges as well. Now, revamping undergraduate education through a 4-year liberal arts science education degree with multiple entry and exit options is a great idea, but may result in serious conflicts among educationists on one side and the need to be employable early on the other side, besides adding to the cost. Design of curriculum to create at every level a job role from an industry perspective also can pose problems. Now, a recommendation separating the regulation of schools from aspects such as policy making, school operations, and academic development seems to suggest creating an independent state school regulatory authority in each state, which will prescribe basic uniform standards for public and private schools. The larger question, however, is can we speak of freeing education from multiple regulators as we have today and at the same time seek to create new ones in the same breath? Its implementation will call for structural changes besides investments of several orders of tens, not to speak of the gestation time to stabilize. The transition can be painful, but however, a country on the move will be able to bear all that and move forward, surge forward. The country cannot afford a single child subjected to the vagaries of change, involving Ministry of Women and Child Development, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and Ministry of Education in curriculum development has potential to create a brilliant curriculum. That said, synergy between these various ministries is the key. The draft further, or the policy further, insists on a strong emphasis to reading, writing and numeric skills till class 8th. With 1 in 2 students in India still not able to read and write up to their standard 5, it is an essential move to improve the quality of education. One of the recommendations, like remedial classes, must be received well, though it would need commitment and maturity of all concerned of a very high degree. The draft is fairly impressive in stressing that education is not the problem. Its solutions we find for solving the ills may be the problem. Investments must return value. The policy attempts to veer out from the routine and suggests new ways of addressing old failings. That's the strength of the policy. Friends, now let's aggregate the national education provisions through this video for a bird's eye view. Friends, I will end the first part of my analysis of the national education policy and promise to explore more of the same the next Saturday. Until then, thank you, namaskar and dhanyavad.